Hey everybody, it's Tommy Canale and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. Today is Mob Talk Volume 3. And if you've missed Volume 1 or Volume 2, well, they're in the show notes. But on this series, we're going to hear from Alan Geik, Gianni Russo, Blair Kenny, Georgia Durante, Greg Stejskal, Dan Moldea, Tamer Elnoury, Sean Patrick Griffin, Frank Hayde, Gary Jenkins and Geoff Schumacher, Larry Henry and Jeff Gearman, and Geno Munari, all on this episode of Mob Talk Volume 3. If you want to hear the entire episodes of any of these interviews, see the show notes as I put links to all of them so you can catch them in their entirety. We're going to kick it off with Alan Geik talking about Murder Incorporated. It gets a little farther with Abe Kid Twist Ruelas, who becomes an informant and basically tells that Charlie killed Dutch Schultz, and then Uncle Charlie received a life sentence.
Correct.
Where did Abe Ruelas come into this whole picture?
He was one of the Murder Incorporated hitmen.
Okay.
He had a position of fairly high up in that hierarchy, and a new DA took over in Brooklyn, and no one really thought all these murders had an organization behind it. There was just a lot of murders in New York and Brooklyn, and this DA named William O'Dwyer, who was born in Ireland, a laborer, a policeman, became DA. He went after them, and a few lucky breaks, which I went through in the book. Abe Ruelas wound up informing on Murder Incorporated, and as soon as it became obvious that it was a group of hired hitmen under, as you mentioned, Lepke and Albert Anastasia, a reporter called it Murder Incorporated for the first time, and the name stuck to this day. Here we are 80 years later talking about Murder Incorporated. And Abe Ruelas and another one of the hitmen, TikTok, Tannenbaum, his name was, they both were ready to testify against Uncle Charlie. And a lot of them, they were getting convicted. As soon as this case broke open, it wasn't like now, you get a death sentence, you're going the next month. And so to avoid the death sentence, he pleaded no contest and got a life sentence, and he was paroled after 23 years. But one of the, when you asked earlier about how this all appeared as a younger person, I remember walking on the boardwalk in Coney Island with a few, my father, some of his friends, maybe my mother was there too. And we walked by and someone pointed to the building that Abe Ruelas was thrown out of a hotel. Supposedly he jumped or was trying to escape with
He was
bed sheets,
forcibly.
He was. I mean, it was ridiculous. He was. They had him in a hotel under heavy guard because he was testifying against everybody. And someone pointed out and said, "Oh, that's the building Abe Ruelas was. He was thrown out that window." And I said, I was 9. I said, "You mean someone was thrown out of a window?" And then they said, "Yeah, the police threw him out. The police threw him out of a window." I was 9 years old, and they said, "Yeah," and it was right near the fun house. And this was their jokes. That was their idea of dad jokes at the time.
You brought up Sammy Cass earlier. What was his impact on how Murder Incorporated was so effective?
Sammy, from what I understood from my father, brother, and bits and pieces from Sammy, he was very close to us for his whole life. When he got out of jail after the Waxy Gordon bust in the late 60s. And Sammy worked for Waxy Gordon. He was a teenager when Waxy went to jail, and he became one of the Murder Incorporated guys, along with Uncle Charlie. They all knew each other. It was amazing. It was sort of like people in a big band in the 50s. Years later, they're all going to still know each other. But Sammy was a young hitman And he was the most, we always joked in the family, he was the most hardened criminal of all of them. He went from Waxy Gordon's right-hand man to being Fat Tony's right-hand man. And Fat Tony was one of the people who always looked out for my father's business. Tony went to jail around the time my father died, but my as we joked, and as the joke was, Sammy Cass was the closest Jew to Fat Tony, and they loved each other because they both had that old school mentality. So Sammy was always a criminal and never anything else, but one of the more funny and lovable characters in our family culture.
Here's Gianni Russo to talk about Frank Costello. Gianni, how did Frank Costello protect you?
Frank Costello, I would have to say, once he found out who I was, I went to Delancey Street one morning with my grandfather, and he was buying pencils and pads for the club. You know, they all had games and all that. And he'd make once a month, he'd go get all that stuff from a guy called Leo Rabinowitz, who would be my first Jewish faith man that I met. And I'd met so many after that I could still mentor. A guy I just got off the phone with, Al Malnick, who's 10 years older than me. And if anybody knows who he is, forget about it. He's a major guy. But with Costello, he'd cross from the west side to the east side every day. He lived up on the west side. And he'd come down 59th Street. And when I finally exhausted my ballpoint pen business downtown in Wall Street and all that area, so I moved uptown and with my business. And I got off the train and on 59th Street and Fifth Avenue. And I got off on the Central Park side. When I looked out, there was the Sherry Netherlands. And all these people looked like they were dressed for church. And this was the middle of the week. These guys were all ready, So I walked across the street and I stayed there about a year selling ballpoint pens right outside of it. And this guy would come every day, never take a pen, give me words of wisdom, talk to me. Always, before he left, always grab my left shoulder, which was still, deformed in a way. My whole left side was still. It took about 3 or 4 years of rehabilitation to get it normal. So one day he said to me, "What's your name, son?" I said, Gianni. He said, "Gianni what?" "Gianni Russo." He said, "Who's Angelo Russo to you?" I said, "Angelo Russo." I said, "Angelo Russo is my great uncle from Sicily." He said, "Oh, yeah? When's the last time you saw him?" I said, "I never saw him." He said, "Why is that?" I said, "Well, if you know him, you should tell me." I didn't know who he was, but he was the boss of the Genovese crime family at the time. And the guy that was with him, who I thought was his friend, was his bodyguard. Mm. So, and I had an attitude because, anybody being in a mental institution for 5 years and finally getting out, and for the people who didn't read the book, I'm not going to tell you how I got out, but
Right. Read the book.
Which, and that in itself gave me a credibility I really didn't need or want, but I got it. With that said, I told him, you told me. He said, "No, I asked you." He said, "How come you have an attitude?" I said, "Don't ask me why I got an attitude. I don't even know who you are." So he said, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Why didn't you see him?" I said, "Well, they hung my uncle in 1948 while they were cleaning up La Cosa Nostra in Sicily." So he says to the guy, Blackie, that I found his name out later, he's, "Take that cigar box." I said, "You ain't taking my cigar box." And he took a roll of money out I never saw in my life. Up until that time, I was an altar boy, then went to Bellevue, and then I'm working in a bakery. He had a wad of cash I couldn't believe. He peeled off 3 $100 bills and bought $10 worth of ballpoint pens. And he said, "Now I bought the pens, okay?" It's okay. He said, "You know where the Waldorf is?" And again, with my attitude, not knowing it was an attitude, I said, I know where the Waldorf is. I know where every public bathroom is in New York. I live on the streets. So he said, "Meet me under the clock in the lobby. You know where that is?" I said, "Of course." So he said, "Meet me at 11 o'clock. I was there at 10. I wanted to make sure I didn't miss this guy. He gave me $300. Forget about it.
Right.
So with that said, he sent Blackie out to get me, and I walked through what was called Peacock Alley, which is ironic because friends of mine just bought it. That's another story. The Waldorf they bought. And they kept it the same way it is. But I went in there, and he said to me, I got to tell you something. You'll never be on the street again. Your great uncle brought my mother and father to America. And the reason I'm here is in Carlo Gambino. He could go on and on and on. He said, I can name every crime boss out of Sicily that he was responsible for. He said, I'll never get you in trouble out of respect to your family. You're going to be my personal messenger. I said, great. I said, the guy gave me $300. What do I care? Every time I saw the guy, though, it was even crazier. Every time I saw him, he'd shake my hand with a $100 bill in it. I tried to bunk into him casually every day to be somewhere else. But that was my story, and it's so crazy.
Up next, Blair Kenny, as we talk about the Rochester Mob and the murder and attempted murders of Sammy G.
I mean, they actually took the offensive in trying to murder Sammy G, and then they started blowing up the gambling parlors to cut off the revenue.
Yeah, speaking of Sammy G, there was a decision to put a hit out on him. They had 5 unsuccessful attempts on Sammy G's life, and then in April, they finally killed him from a car blast that actually blew his leg off in very nasty car bomb. But what do you know, Blair, about these 5 unsuccessful attempts? I mean, how do you miss a guy 5 times?
Well, because it was kind of stupid. The one time they planted a bomb in a snowbank because they knew that it was the route from the parking lot to this bar that they frequented, and they figured they had to park their car and walk down the sidewalk to get into this bar. So when they were walking down the sidewalk to get into the bar, they detonated the bomb, and the timing was off, and it blew one of the guys off his feet, but didn't really injure him. So that was one of the attempts. And then another one of their other attempts was they had a bomb, and they had a suitcase bomb, or like a attaché case bomb, and they were going to leave it. They were going to leave it at the telephone booth inside this bar. But they had to set it up with phone calls to get the exact moment. They were going to summon Sammy G to the phone like he had a phone call, and then detonate the bomb. Well, to set the timing right, they needed to talk to each other. And one of the guys was on the line, tying up the line, talking to his girlfriend. So the whole, for whatever reason. So that whole plan got scrapped. And I'm not real familiar offhand with the other attempts, but
I mean, that's enough. I mean, these guys got to get it together. I mean, they finally did. And when they got him really good. But I mean, when you're missing, I mean, some of these things are just kind of comical looking back on what were you guys doing?
Oh, it's terrible.
The B team, this was, I mean, the era then was fires and bombings and car bombs. That was the era then of how things were done outside. I mean, it's always been shootings, but this was the era of fires and bombs. The B team started bombing the A team's gambling establishments, thinking that if they took out the gambling establishments, that this could end the war because they would have nothing left. It seemed like that was not the way it was working. And the A team said, no, we're not going down that road either.
No, it actually, despite the bombings, and there was quite a few, it didn't really deter the gambling. They were hoping to deter people from coming and really shut down their business. And without any source of revenue, I don't know what their plan was after that, to tell you the truth. But it wasn't the best plan.
We're going to hear from Georgia Durante and how she became a driver for the mob.
Well, I was in an after-hour club in New York City with my friend, which actually was I used to work at this after-hour club because I was dating the owner. It was with my girlfriend Susie Q, which is a friend of ours, her mother.
Okay.
But this night I was working alone, and I just set a drink down in front of this guy, and he pulls out a gun and shoots the guy next to him. I'm 5 feet away, and everybody scattered. And Frankie, who I was dating, he was the owner of the club, he threw me the car keys, and he says, "Georgie girl, get the car, pull it up." And they got his body down 2 flights of stairs, and they threw him in the back seat, jumped in the car, and I got him to Bellevue Hospital in record time. I would see a cop. I knew I had to slow down, but we got him there, and then they pulled his body out of the car, left him on the sidewalk, beeped the horn, and we took off. And the whole time I was like, I had it together. And it was after we dropped him off that I kind of like freaked out. You know?
I'm sure.
But anyway, all they talked about was, "Man, Georgie girl, can you drive a car?" Right?
It's those golf carts back in the day.
Yeah, they talked about how I drove the car for months, you know, and it was the topic of conversation whenever we went into a bar or anything. You know, they would, bring it up. And then I went back to Rochester for a weekend, and I ran into Sammy G, who was the godfather of that area. Now, this guy had watched me grow up and kind of was my protector. And anyway, he said, "Georgia, I need you to do me a favor." And I said, "Sure, Sammy, what do you want me to do?" And he said, "I need you to deliver a message for me." He says, "If anybody finds out about this, they're going to find my body in the Genesee River." He said, "You can't tell anyone about this." I said, "No problem, So he shows up at my door the next day with a sealed envelope, and I fly back to New York, and there's this black limousine waiting for me with this guy inside, and they drive into Brooklyn, and they park the limo like 2 blocks away from the restaurant, and then we had to walk all the way to the restaurant. And I'm thinking, why did they do that? But I didn't ask any questions. I knew better than to ask any questions. I get escorted into this back room, and there's 4 guys sitting there waiting for me. And I'm introduced as Georgie girl. That's what they used to call me in New York. That was kind of my nickname. And so when I was introduced, this guy's eyebrow kind of raised up, and he just looked at me like he recognized the name and the talk about the town, how I drove the car that night. So I hand them the message. They open it and read it, and they pass it to the next guy. And the one guy says to me, "You tell Mr. G he's going to have to meet with me in person." And I said, "Oh, wait a minute. I'm just a messenger. I have no idea what's in there, right?" So now I'm being escorted out of the restaurant. And the guy says to me, "The old man really liked you." And I said, "Which old man?" They were all old. I'm like 70, right? So it turned out it was Carlo Gambino. Now, at the time, he was the godfather. And anyway, they must have figured, if Sammy could trust me with that message, they knew I could drive. I was appearing on covers of magazines. Who was going to ever suspect me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they started using me to pick up packages and deliver them in different places. And I would always deliver a lot of these packages to JFK Airport to these guys in suits. Still never asking a question. But I later found out that these guys were the CIA, and they were actually laundering the money for the CIA in foreign countries. And I always said, the mob may have pulled the trigger, but the CIA loaded the gun.
Love that line.
So, yeah, when my book came out, somebody said, "Aren't you afraid of the mob guys?" And no, I'm really more afraid of the CIA.
When you were being a courier for Carlo Gambino, and delivering these messages back and forth. Were you still doing stuff for Sammy G?
No. Actually, once I got to New York, Rochester was kind of out of the whole deal. But it kind of progressed, and it progressed to, they called it pickup. And I assume what they were doing was, breaking legs and doing whatever they had to do to get their vig, which is the interest owed to them. And I would always wait around the corner. And one day they came out with their guns out and flung open the doors and jumped in and said, step on it. And then I heard sirens in the background. And man, I knew I had to get away or somebody was going to die. And I did. And that was probably the worst thing I could have done, because then they wanted to use me all the time. And you just don't say no to these guys easily, especially if they've done favors for you. They expect you to be there for them,
Mm-hmm. Here's a great inside story from former FBI agent Greg Stejskal on the Detroit Family Mafia. June 11th, 1979. What did you witness that had historical significance, but not really for almost 20 years later?
I was, at that time, working on the Detroit surveillance squad, and the surveillance squad had been set up by early on and was primarily created for us to follow people in the Detroit family and others that would come into town to visit them, the Detroit family being the mafia. And on different days, we'd follow different people. We had source information as to certain meetings and things that we would surveil. And on that particular day, and we had set up on a known business of Rafael Quasarano, who was he was a barber supply shop up in Macomb County. On that particular day, we saw Jack Tocco, who we knew is high up in the Detroit family, enter that business. And later we saw another guy who was a made man, Frank Bomarito, enter the business. Now, Frank came in a van and then came out of the business and left in Jack Tocco's car. And later we saw Jack Tocco, Quasarano, and a couple other guys come out of the business and get in that van and start driving west. And as they're driving, we're trying to speculate as to where they're going, because they continued well past the western suburbs of Detroit. And about the same time, we could hear on the radio the other crew that was up that day was following one of the other members of the family. They were heading the same direction we were. And we ended up north of Chelsea, Michigan, which is probably about 50 miles west of Detroit, just basically out in the country. There was a game farm. As we were surveilling the entrance to the game farm, we saw several cars go in there. We were able to identify some of the people going in. And every car that, at least that we could identify, we knew was tied into people in the mafia. So the Detroit family. And so we were trying to figure out whether this is some kind of big meeting or conclave. And so I got together with my crew. The other crew was there. They had followed their guy there. And so I said to one of the guys on my crew, we got to go in there and see what's going on. And a couple other people are kind of hesitant. They're going, well, yeah, maybe we should call in and get permission and stuff. And I kind of said, well, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission sometimes. So I had one of the other agents drive us, and another guy volunteered to go with me. He says, hey, if you're going in, you shouldn't go in alone. I'll go in with you. And it was a guy by the name of Keith Cordes, and we went around to the west end of where this property was and climbed over a fence, started going through the woods. And we walked for probably a mile or so into the woods, and we could hear them talking, but the foliage was so thick and stuff, we really couldn't see much, and we couldn't really understand what they were saying. And we're thinking, geez, if we get much closer, we'll be able to see them, but they'll be able to see us too. And up in front of me, I saw this place where the foliage had all been cleared. It was like a lane, and I realized it was an archery lane. There was an archery target at one end. It was probably 50 yards from where they were all meeting. And so Keith and I got behind the target. I had taken my camera. I had a 300 millimeter lens, so I rested the camera on top of the target and took a couple photos. And one of them in particular was a picture of Jack Tocco, and to his left was Vito Giacalone, that same guy that had met with Hoffa a few days before he disappeared. And on his other side was Anthony Corrado. Both of them were capos in the Detroit family. And of course, Jack Tocco was high up. I think at the time he was second to the head of the family. And so I've got this picture of them. And then by that time, we had a plane up over the thing, and they said, the plane saying, hey, it looks like they're releasing some dogs. And so we thought, discretion's a better part of valor. So we took off through the woods, knowing that the dogs would find us otherwise. And so we went back out of the woods, and, I developed the photo. One of them turned out pretty well. There's a copy of it in the book. But, when we came out of there, we were thinking, we got this photo, and we're not exactly sure what was going on in there. Later on, we got source information, very good source information, that was the day we were celebrating Jack Tocco's promotion to be head of the family, the Detroit family of the mafia. And I talked to a mafia historian, a guy who's primarily expert on the Detroit family. He said, Greg, I don't know of any time anybody has ever witnessed something like that wasn't a member of the family. And believe me, there wouldn't be any photos of it because those guys know better than to have people taking photos.
Right.
So, he said, so that, almost 20 years later, we had a big RICO trial, again, racketeer influenced corrupt organization. And Jack Tocco and all the hierarchy of the family were put on trial, and we introduced that picture into evidence. They didn't want it in evidence, but it turned out to be a key piece of evidence. I mean, there's nothing better than to show them a picture of a guy who is becoming the head of the family, who happens to be on trial for being head of the family. So, and interestingly, a few weeks before the trial, Vito Giacalone pled guilty. He did not go to trial. Several of the other guys did, but he didn't. He pled guilty, and much to the surprise of everybody, stood up in open court and told the judge asked him, why are you pleading guilty? And he said, well, I'm a member of the Detroit family of the La Cosa Nostra, and, and I'm pleading guilty because I was involved in this stuff. And then to have that picture to show the jury on trial, and we could get it into the court record,
that photograph led to, if I remember right in your book, like 50 counts in the RICO Act. Yeah, and it wasn't just the photo. We had all kinds of other evidence, but that was a pretty strong piece of evidence as to the existence of the family and what the hierarchy was and everything. We couldn't have a Mob Talk volume whatever without including Dan Moldea and his story of what's going on in the Jimmy Hoffa investigation.
The FBI reached out to me and they said, we're interested. We're very interested right now in what you have going on. And so we started talking. I created a web page for the FBI where I put on videotapes, documents, photographs, timelines, a history of my entire investigation of what was going on. And then I answered all their questions, anything they wanted. I was happy. And this was use it or lose it time, man. This is, this murder was in 1975. Once again, I am Ahab, and this is my white whale. And doggone it, this is it. I'm 72 years old right now. I'll be 73 next month. And this is it. I'm not going to have this moment again. I am going to give up everything now. I want this thing. This is it. And so the FBI got a search warrant for the area. First, they had a meeting. I was invited to a meeting in Newark, star-studded, and where I was like a Vegas lounge act walking around the room talking about the Hoffa case. And then they continued their investigation. In October of 2021, they dropped a search warrant on the area of the alcove. See, the alcove being under the bridge is controlled by the state of New Jersey. The Department of Transportation controls everything on the bridge and under the bridge. So there shouldn't be anything buried there. And so the FBI dropped a search warrant, and they went in and they searched the area. They did no digging, but they did scans. So then, fast forward 2022, we had given I had members of my team had done a GPR, ground penetrating radar, examination of the area. One in last fall, in the fall of 2021, where they detected something, barrels. And it was by one of their GPR people. Then they went back 6 months later with a new GPR technician, a new ground penetrating radar technician who was not told what the first technician found, and on his own found exactly the same spot. Now, when the FBI went back for their second bite of the apple in June of 2022, a few months ago, the FBI wasn't and again, I made an issue about this in the New York Times, and I have no regrets. I have nothing but respect for the FBI. They are heroes in this thing, because I was piggybacking on an FBI lead from 1975 when they flipped Ralph Picardo. I wouldn't even be in this game if it wasn't for the FBI flipping Ralph Picardo in November 1975, which led to the grand jury, which led to the FBI's first search of the Moscato's dump in December of 1975. I mean, the FBI deserves so much credit for that, because I have piggybacked on that. All I really want is a generous assist on this for everything that we've done in the meantime. I mean, I brought this case back to life, and I kept it going. Well, the FBI says they found nothing. They said they found nothing at the location, and they did digging. But then I made the inquiry. I said, did you dig where the one spot we gave you that our company did? And it turns out they had not.
Are there plans to dig there then, Dan?
Well, I have just been wasting the past 6-7 months trying to help very tactically and diplomatically, trying to get all the people involved in this thing back together to go down there and look at the spot that we had. That one GPR guy found last fall, or in the fall of 2021, and that another GPR guy from the same company, but not knowing the results of GPR number 1 6 months earlier, came to exactly the same conclusion. It came to the exact same spot. And we were first told we dug there. And so I sent one of our guys down to Moscato's dump, or down to the alcove, and I said, I want film. And we could see, I got film, and you would see where the FBI had really torn up the area. It looked like a strip mining area. And then we went to the one spot that we had given them, it was pristine. They needed, let alone an excavator. They hadn't even stuck a shovel in this area. And I complained about it. I said, guys, what? here's the area. This is the one place we gave you. And they said, we scanned there. And I said, I'm sorry. If you had scanned there, you would have come up with the same scans. GPR1 and GPR2 came up with 6 months apart from each other. And so we're trying to very diplomatically, because we're dealing with the greatest law enforcement agency in the history of the world. We're trying to get this thing resolved because I'm on the hook here. I've pushed all my chips in on this thing, and I'm not wrong. He is there. He is there. I don't know if he's in this particular location or another location, but he is in that alcove. There's no way that Picardo did not lie to the FBI in 1975 because he was going to lose his federal witness protection status if he did lie. Fro Moscato did not lie to me in 2007 to 2014 when I was involved. And Frank Coppola's father did not lie to him, and Frank Coppola did not lie to me. Hoffa is there.
Here's Tamer Elnoury to talk about busting the terrorist and a recording mishap. What is the feeling you get when a criminal tells you all their secrets because he feels he can trust you?
I don't have a feeling one way or the other as far as I remember to compare it back to my drug days. A lot of times you'd be working a subject and you're infiltrating a group, and the day comes when he's bringing a boatload of heroin or cocaine or whatever the case may be to a location. Your heart's racing, your palms are sweating until that bag opens up. And every time that happened for me, I've been involved in well over 2,500 of these operations. And I'll tell you, every single time, it wasn't until I got eyes on the drugs that I had this sense of calm and relief. Gotcha. That was essentially what it was. And then you almost hear it in the recordings after. You could hear the tension in my voice until you see the drugs, until you see the weapons, until you see whatever it is I'm buying. Once I see it, I know the case is closed. I know he's under arrest. He just doesn't know it yet. And now it's just a matter of tidying up, because the culmination of the investigation, whether it's a week or a year, leads up to that moment. With the counterterrorism subjects, I already know their intentions. I already know what they want to do and how they want to kill people and hurt people. And once I'm in their inner circle, hearing their plans, hearing their stories, getting them to commit these overt acts, being a part of them committing these overt acts to prepare for these attacks, I never had that aha moment. It's different. It's actually sickening. And I had to suppress, because every fiber of me wants to explain, no, listen, you have this all twisted up. I'm not an expert in my religion, but I know it. And I know it well enough to know why and how they're twisting it. It takes everything in me not to point these things out. So I don't have that same aha moment like I do with the drug world, but there's this repeated excitement knowing that every time they spew that, that's a less likelihood that they're going to go to trial, that we play that for the jury, they're done, they're buried, and every overt act just means we're getting closer to the end of this investigation, and I can take this piece of crap off the street.
You just mentioned when you were talking about you can hear things on tape in your voice. Normally when I talk to somebody that's been in your field, they've had some kind of mishap with recordings. Did something happen like that with you as well?
Yeah. It's ironic too, because it was a new piece of equipment, and headquarters asked me to try it in this high profile case. And I was like, sure, why not? It seemed harmless. Without getting into specifics, we entered into an area of Montreal, Canada, a very industrial section that apparently, because of the lines, the electricity, the currents, something way beyond my understanding, something in the scientific world managed somehow to change this piece of equipment from go back and forth. It was asinine to put in a covert's lap, but that's neither here nor there. We were driving, and in that 2.5 seconds, I could hear my backup team, their voices clear as day, coming through this piece of equipment. And thankfully, it was located next to a GPS thingamajigger, those Garmin thingies.
Oh, yeah.
And when Shahab's eyes went right to it, I knew what his thoughts were. It's like, what in the hell was that? And he's already paranoid, the way he makes me take the battery out of my phone and so on and so forth whenever we're going to these clandestine meets and so on and so forth. So for him to have that look on his face, I managed to just smash the GPS and prayed that the actual piece of equipment stopped, and it did. So yeah, that was one of the worst mishaps I've ever had.
I'm sure it was. Let's hear from Sean Patrick Griffin on Tim Donaghy and the NBA betting scandal.
From 03 to 06, so it's 3 NBA seasons, the pro gamblers are copying the bets that Donaghy is placing with Jack and Cannon. You flash forward to November of 2006. Tim Donaghy starts complaining to Tommy Martino that Jack and Cannon is losing money betting down Atlantic City, and he's not paying me all my winners. And he's upset. He wants to bet with somebody else. Well, Tommy Martino is constantly in contact with Jimmy Batista. And Batista says, well, hey, let him bet with me. He doesn't tell him, hey, just so you know, I've been copying those bets for the last 3 years. He just says, hey, well, have him bet with me. And so they schedule this infamous meeting at the Philadelphia International Marriott in December of 06. I think it's December 12th for whatever reason. And they have this meeting, and the deal is Batista says, hey, look, 2 things. First of all, if we're going to do this, I only want you giving the information to me. I don't want Jack and Cannon involved in this at all. By the way, Jimmy knew Jack too. This is a crowd from that area. It's no big deal. Well, anyway, so he says, I don't want Jack and Cannon involved at all. It's got to be just through me. And you have to get the picks earlier because I'm going to manipulate worldwide betting lines. And the earlier, the better for me to actually play those lines. And I know for your audience that doesn't know gambling, trust me, I didn't do this before I took on the Game in the Game project either. The way that these people make their really good money is if a team is favored by X number of points, 3 points for argument's sake, and they know which side is more likely to win, they're going to try and move that line depending on where the line is. So if they want it to 6 points, they can bet strategically around the world because of partly how much money they're betting, but also betting patterns. They know the algorithms and the way the sports books work. They'll bet on one side of the proposition at one point and then purposely manipulate the worldwide betting market for as long as they can. And then the next day, they're going to bet as much on the other side as they can. That's the way they make their money. It's sort of an investment to bring back a big return, but it's only happening in a span of 24 hours. So those are the 2 conditions that they cut the deal. So the answer to your question is they hadn't actually met physically. I think the last time that Donaghy and Batista had been in each other's presence was Tommy Martino's wedding. Otherwise, they kept clear of each other. First of all, they weren't friends. But secondly, they knew Tim Donaghy didn't want to be in the presence of a professional gambler, and Batista didn't want to be in the presence of a referee, especially starting in 03 when he knew what was going on. They were smart enough to do that. So that's the answer to your question.
Who was the FBI target then? Was it Donaghy? Was it Batista? Who was the FBI target?
Oh, my goodness. You're the first person to ask that question. It's a great question. At that moment in time, the target is Tim Donaghy, but it's especially Jimmy Batista. And the reason I say it's a great question is because the public has assumed all these years. I mean, this all starts happening in 2007. It hits the media in 2009. People have thought ever since then that the target was Tim Donaghy. It wasn't, because once they realized what was happening and they started looking into Jimmy Batista, they realized what he was doing, because they not only had access to Batista, they're looking at the phone logs of a handful of professional gamblers. Again, Tommy, you and I are having this conversation in September of 2022. It's outrageous, and it's media malpractice that most of the public doesn't know the names of the FBI agents who worked the case. and they don't know the names of the professional gamblers who are betting on this. And the reason I bring that up is because with regard to this ridiculousness that Donaghy was the target, the reason that Batista was the target was because once they got access to the phone logs of the pro gamblers, they realized, holy smokes, these guys are betting millions of dollars offshore, which is blatantly illegal. Never mind the worry about fixing games. They're betting offshore, which is illegal. And especially there's tax evasion and money laundering. How are they bringing millions of dollars onshore every day? The feds found that mind-boggling, and they thought that Batista was going to be the key to pick that lock. That if they could get him on the NBA scandal and flip him, they could care less about this nuisance white collar gambling thing. They're thinking, man, we can explore this entire offshore sportsbook money laundering thing. Because we're talking about the NBA betting scandal, but if you're an FBI agent, you're thinking, wait a second, drug dealers, terrorists, anybody can put money in an offshore sportsbook account, theoretically to quote unquote bet, but then just get the money paid off in the United States and you've successfully laundered millions of dollars.
Up next, it's Frank Hayde on his book Mafia Dreams, which you should get. But this clip is about Oscar Goodman. Did Oscar Goodman come into play in this case at all?
So I think that is a very interesting element of this story, especially for folks in Las Vegas. Oscar Goodman had a long history in Kansas City. He represented the Nick and Carl Sevilla back in the 60s, 70s, and on up into the 80s. He represented Tony Sevilla. He was at the strawman trials in Kansas City. So Oscar Goodman had pretty close associations with some of these important gangsters in Kansas City. But then later in this story, Oscar Goodman represented Jim Whining, who was Travis Riley's very close associate. Jim Whining had taken Mutual of Omaha for $236 million. And Oscar Goodman represented Jim Whining in Kansas City at this time. Now, here's the biggest takeaway here. Jim Whining was a rat. Now, I know that Oscar Goodman, part of his brand was that he did not represent rats.
Right.
The only good rat was a dead rat, according to Oscar Goodman. Now, I really admire Oscar Goodman in many ways. I've read everything I can about the guy. I've read his biography. I think there's a lot to admire about Oscar Goodman in many ways in terms of being a truly independent political figure who's really not beholden to either party. I think that's rare and refreshing. As far as I know, he's still popular in Vegas for having, done a lot of things that benefited Las Vegas. He's a fun guy. He's a colorful guy. But in this case, I think that there's maybe a little hypocrisy there because I know that Oscar Goodman did, in fact, represent a rat named Jim Whining in Kansas City. He got him I'll say this for him. He got him a good deal, very good deal. Jim Whining was found guilty, but he got probation on a $236 million fraud.
Wow.
So, but again, I don't think that sweetheart sentence would have happened without the fact that he was a rat and he helped bring down Travis Riley. So just an interesting twist to the story that involved, you can't really, whenever you talk about organized crime in Kansas City, it always leads to Las Vegas at some point, right? Whether it's back in the 60s or 70s or 80s or the straw man and the skimming, or even in this story with this kind of heretofore unknown and obscure element of Oscar Goodman's career.
On Oscar Goodman, completely unrelated to this case, do you know anything about the story of how Oscar Goodman had a role in saving Lefty Rosenthal's life?
Yeah, that's an interesting story too. And I get into that a little bit in the book. And again, it comes back to Kansas City where agents had a wiretapped, they had wiretapped a phone in Nick Savilla's lawyer's office. And Nick Savilla was the godfather in Kansas City for many years, very powerful on the national scene with the Teamsters Union and beyond. But Savilla was talking to Lefty Rosenthal in Vegas. And wait a minute. No, I'm sorry. He was talking to Oscar Goodman on the phone. They were talking about Lefty Rosenthal.
Okay.
And Savilla asked Goodman, is he crazy? Meaning, is Lefty crazy? Goodman said, no, I don't think he's crazy. Well, the FBI in court testified that that was a code conversation, that crazy was code word for, is he talking? Is he loose-lipped? Is he someone who might need to be eliminated? And so when Goodman said, no, I don't think Lefty's crazy, that according to the FBI at the time anyway, that saved Lefty's life. Otherwise, Savilla would have moved in and taken steps to had Lefty killed, which we know happened later anyway with the car bombing, et cetera, in Las Vegas. But Goodman laughs that off and said he didn't know it at the time, but apparently he saved Lefty Rosenthal's life. So I think Goodman sort of gets a chuckle out of that whole story. But maybe the FBI was just, really reaching, try to paint the picture as such. But then I'm sure there's folks out there who believe the FBI on that, think that, that Goodman was indeed a lot closer, was a counselor, more of a consigliere than a counselor in lawyerly sense. Or that perception still.
Here is Gary Jenkins and Geoff Schumacher on the show what we did on the Las Vegas Skim, and we talk about Alan Glick. Some of the key government witnesses where I want to go next was Alan Glick, Argent Corporation owner. He said he was intimidated into fronting the mob. The state of Nevada forced Glick to give up his casino license. He testified he did not know there were mob ties of Frank Ballesteri. But although Alan Glick went to school with one of his sons, Joe, I don't know what kind of friends they were. I don't know if they were even close associates or not. Who Alan was and how he was intimidated.
Well, I don't know. Alan Glick was, he was kind of like Lefty Rosenthal. He was magic. He just walked through this whole thing unscathed and made a lot of money when he sold the 4 casinos, is my understanding. But he was a kind of a small-time entrepreneur out there, and I think he got the connection to Ballesteri to another Teamster that he had met somewhere, and got a Teamster tried to get a smaller Teamsters loan to do some kind of development. Teamsters pension fund had got onto this; they could make more money from making these loans and going into the stock market. So they were investing their members' money in these loans and using the interest and getting the money paid back too. And they, the loans, they were paying the loans back. They weren't just taking the money, stealing it. They were paying the loans back. And he got that, but then he was told by somebody that if you want to get a big Teamsters loan, you need to go to Milwaukee and see this man, Frank Ballesteri. Now his story is that, so he, calls up there and gets an appointment with this Mr. Ballesteri, and Ballesteri says, I think we can do a deal. It's kind of a funny thing. It's a weird thing. He had Glick, I don't know how he explained this because I know it's in the evidence. He had Glick sign an agreement that if he left the casino, he would then sell it to Ballesteri for like $50,000 or some, just small amount. I don't know how they ever explained that one, but because the government were willing to trade his testimony, they didn't question anything more about our friend, Mr. Glick. They needed his testimony, and he buried him. He buried Nick Savella like you can't believe. Of course, Nick died before he actually went to trial, but he buried him. He was, and Tuffy Luna, he buried both of them, as he testified that one evening, Lefty Rosenthal came to him and said, we got to go to Kansas City and meet this man. And Alan Glick said, oh, well, okay, I don't know what you're talking about, but I'll go. Go figure. And they buy this. So they have a private jet. They fly to Kansas City to take them to the Marriott Hotel, and he describes all this. The Marriott Hotel on the airport grounds. It's really there. Says he's ushered into a room. They're met by Tuffy de Luna. They go to the hotel. They're ushered into a room, and there's a man in there, and there's only one light, a lamp. And he said he's instructed to sit in this chair with the lamp shining in his face, and just outside of the glow of the light from the lamp in the dark is another man who they say is Nick Savella. And Nick Savella says, if it's up to me, you never leave this room alive, and you owe me $1 million. And Glick says, well, I don't know. I can never pay that. I don't know what you're talking about. He says, you don't worry about it. You don't have to pay it back. You've got a man working for you. This guy right here, some words to that effect, he can take care of that. So what they were trying to do is intimidate Glick into getting in the line and not standing in the way of the Skim coming out of his casino. So that's, and they, for that kind of testimony, you can let a guy walk. I think he didn't have a record of any kind, didn't have any prior history. So they let him walk for that kind of testimony and other testimony. He testified, he buried Tuffy de Luna. He claims that he testified that he was told to go to Oscar Goodman's office. When he gets there, there's a man he's told is Carl Tuffy de Luna. Tuffy de Luna picks up a piece of paper and reads off the name of his wife and his kids. And he said, we want you to sell this casino and you got to get out. Or, you say, maybe you don't have anything to lose, and names off his wife and kids. These people have something to lose. Comes on back. Now, that was verified in some manner in the first microphone interception at the Villa Capri. Tuffy is overheard to say, I told him, I said, boy, you'd make whatever kind of effing notice you have to make and get out. And so that was verification of that story. So, but that's the kind of my take on Alan Glick.
One of the sort of unfortunate things, at least from a historian standpoint, is that Alan Glick really took besides his testimony, he really took his story to the grave. He, as far as we know, he never wrote anything down. He never wrote a book. He never did a podcast. He never did a documentary or anything where because he could have really provided a lot of context and a lot of information that we don't have if he had come forward and more later, but he never did. And, maybe the mob appreciates that he didn't come forward, but, that was one of those unfortunate things. We kept waiting.
Now it's Larry Henry, and he's going to tell you about the violence back in the day of the reporters and even current day with Jeff Gearman. And we hear from Jeff as he tells a story about Tony Spilotro.
Back, Tommy, to the 50s, a guy named Ed Reed, a reporter whose reporting had led to a Pulitzer Prize for the Brooklyn Eagle, had come out to Las Vegas, worked for the Sun, was looking into the mob. He said because it's one of the greatest concentration of mobsters in the country, hoodlums he called them, was at the Desert Inn. And Jack Dragner from Los Angeles was sitting in the Desert Inn and a sheriff was there. It shows how that sort of the public officials were in bed with the mobsters. And Ed Reed was beat up at the Desert Inn. Now fast forward to Jeff Gearman's era, late 70s and onward. And Jeff got punched. Jeff's car windows were broken. He was threatened in other ways. Ned Day's car was firebombed. He wasn't in it, but there were wanted posters for Ned Day around town, a reporter for the Valley Times, Review Journal, and KLAS TV, whose career was shorter than Jeff's because he died relatively young, but mirrored Jeff's in around the same time frame. So, yeah, those guys just thought they could push people around and did in many cases, and many people were afraid of them. Keep in mind, Tommy, these guys walked around flaunting what they had. They were arrogant in their belief that they controlled that town. Frank Rosenthal, who illegally ran 4 Argent Corp casinos, as you said at the top, he wrote a newspaper column for the Valley Times and the Las Vegas Sun. Can you imagine Al Capone writing a column for the Chicago Tribune and had a TV show?
Right.
So, the arrogance of these
from
people.
the big disco place in town.
from Jubilee over there by where Planet Hollywood. Just the arrogance of these people. And that arrogance results from having public officials really sort of under control one way or another. And, it was a different town back then. There was this whole, well, who else is going to run casinos other than the people who did it illegally elsewhere? And they came to Nevada and well, okay, fine. I mean, places like Hot Springs and things like that, these people came to Nevada, but it was not that innocent. I mean, these were just extremely arrogant about their dominance of a criminal activity in Las Vegas, and that is an example of that. This guy punches Jeff in the face. He was a public official on one hand, but was collecting juice money for the mob on the other. What was this guy doing, working on the public payroll?
He also covered organized crime. Tony Spilotro is a very common name in Las Vegas. Was portrayed by Pesci in Casino. Some people say that, he was the guy running Las Vegas at that time. But we're going to hear Jeff tell the story when he goes to a bar and sees Tony Spilotro.
So I'm a young kid, right? I'm just starting out. I'm a cub reporter. My roommate at the time, another young reporter, we decided, it's a Saturday night. We decided to go out. Hey, let's go to the, it was a bar that Tony Spilotro hung out. And it was near the Upper Crust restaurant that they also had an interest in. So we're at the bar, and lo and behold, Tony Spilotro's there, and he's there with Robert Conrad, a big Hollywood actor at the time. He was the star of the Wild Wild West series. And so we're just sitting there. It's just those two and us in the bar. It's a small little quaint bar, and there's a bartender and a waitress. So the waitress comes over, and so we say, hey, let's send a drink over to Tony Spilotro. We didn't know any better. And so the waitress goes over, talks to Spilotro, comes back and says, you don't send Mr. Spilotro drinks. He buys you drinks first. And so we learned right off the bat that this guy is, it was like he owned the town, basically.
We close this episode of Mob Talk Volume 3 with Geno Munari on an episode that was very recent on the Johnny Hicks murder.
Pete Griffin was a very nice, I knew him very well when I was a busboy at the Dunes Hotel. Okay? I've got the Dunes, the Sahara Hotel, my first job when I was in college. And I worked in the dealer's room, and I knew every one of the dealers. And Pete Griffin was one of the nicest guys you'd ever want to meet. And he was a craft dealer. So why he disappeared, he found Johnny's body, by the way, on the staircase. He said he heard some noise, and he went outside and he found him. And he took him to the hospital, and of course he died. But when Johnny was involved a little bit later in the shooting of a guy by the name of Murphy, and Johnny talked about why he was there. He admitted that he was involved in a cheating ring. Okay, so there's two motives, in my opinion, of why Johnny was killed. Okay, one of them is, of course, that he was screwing around with Lefty's girlfriend, a wife, and that happened. A big time beef broke out between Lefty and Johnny Hicks at the Flamingo Big Al's Speakeasy upstairs. Johnny was there, and in walks Lefty and Jerry, and I guess they make eye contact. She goes over to talk to him, and he wants to dance. They dance. I guess Lefty got really mad. They got into an argument, and they got into a physical fight. And Johnny was beating the hell out of him, had him on the floor, and I don't want to name the guy's name. They pulled him off of him, saved Lefty. I mean, I think that, and the fact that they found out that he may have been involved in the Chip Cup, was the motive of killing Johnny. And I think basically the Chip Cup is even more so. But remember, they had to get in the grounds of the country club to do it, and I believe that Lefty had to use the mob to kill him. There's no question about it in my mind.
Yeah. Now I got a couple things there with Pete Griffith. This is just my personal opinion, people. I'm not saying that this is factual. I've researched it. This is just my personal opinion. Pete Griffith disappears. Either A, he saw who killed Johnny and figured he was next, so he got the hell out of there, or he didn't see who killed Johnny. He may have been involved in the chip cup with Johnny and figured, well, if they got Johnny, I'm probably next, so he took off anyway. Those are just my two theories, Geno, on why this guy just disappeared.
Well, let me answer both of them. You make a lot of sense, Tommy. The first one is he may have seen who was there. And, I was at his house 3 days before, same place. And I was afraid to go to the funeral because I heard that Pete had left town. I was afraid to go there because I was afraid maybe they thought maybe whoever went there was involved in the scam. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really a good possibility. And the second thing is, Pete was a crap dealer. And that was the easiest place to make the move with the chip cup. Did you understand that, or you want me to explain that?
I mean, I explained it, but explain it to my listeners who may not.
Okay. The chip cup was a device. It was an old scam. It wasn't anything new. An old scam redone. And I heard it came from Reno. They used it in Reno, Nevada years and years ago. And basically it was a hollow cylinder that looked like a stack of 4 chips, 4 $5 chips. 3 phony ones on the bottom, which were hollow. And on top, they put a real chip that was a little bit offset, so it looked real. So when you set the money down, you'd square it up with your hands and it looked like a real stack of 4 chips. And they used it. They made the bet. The cheater would be on the outside rail and he'd make a bet of $20 in the field. It was always a 1-roll bet where you win or lost. So the dealer that was working with him would pick it up and then go and bring it back into the rack where the chips are. And he would just momentarily set it on top of the $100 chips. And inside would go 3 chips. He'd pull it back off, and the cheater would immediately throw out a $20 bill and say, change. And then the dealer would go out and give him that chip cup back loaded with 300 in it. It was undetectable. It was never caught in action. And they don't know, famous writer Wallace Turner in the New York Times wrote a story about it. They have no idea how much money was stolen with this chip cup.
That's going to do it for this episode of Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Canale. I want to thank the guests that were clipped into this volume, Series 3. Alan Geik, Gianni Russo, Blair Kenny, Georgia Durante, Greg Stejskal, Dan Moldea, Tamer Elnoury, Sean Patrick Griffin, Frank Hayde, Gary Jenkins, Geoff Schumacher, Larry Henry, Jeff Gearman, and Geno Munari. Do me a favor and take 30 seconds and rate and review the show. 5 stars, nice comments are always appreciated, and that helps me grow the show. Until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.